Britain's Princess Margaret shattered tradition to marry a commoner, Antony Armstrong Jones.
Where people sometimes dispute, well, were Margaret and Tony really in love? The answer is yes, they were. But it was love that blinded them both. People do need to recognise that Tony really was a serial adulterer. After 3 years, really, the cracks were already on the wall.
Do you find your public image as a help or a hindrance in these photographic exhibitions?
Where Tony was concerned, she never wanted to be a divorcee.
On 6th of May, 1960, Princess Margaret married photographer and designer Antony Armstrong Jones. The couple tied the knot in Westminster Abbey, and the ceremony quickly became a landmark occasion as the first royal wedding to be televised. Over 300 million people worldwide watched the royal bride and groom say, "I do." In true Margaret fashion, the princess had broken a centuries-long tradition and married a commoner, the first British royal to marry a non-aristocrat in 400 years. High society and the press alike viewed the pairing as controversial, but such opinions could not stop Tony and Margaret from becoming the nation's golden couple. The public delighted in seeing the young princess finally happy after years of heartbreak, grief, and trouble with love.
For the Queen, his daughter, the widowed Queen, his wife, and Princess Margaret, the great ordeal begins. The imperial crown, with its 3,000 jewels, glints in the fitful light as George VI returns to his sorrowing capital. And with it, on the oak coffin, is the white wreath of his widow. 15 years ago, he walked here behind his dead father, with no thought of crown or throne, a quiet, shy man, thankful that greatness was not to be thrust upon him. But fate ruled otherwise.
Everything fell apart for Margaret in 1952. The king was dead, and her world, as she knew it, changed forever. On 6th of February 1952, King George VI passed away in his sleep after battling lung cancer. His death broke Margaret's heart, and she plunged into a feeling of grief and despair. Margaret struggled to sleep at night without prescribed sedatives, and she described feeling like she was in a black hole throughout this period of her life. Margaret was one of the last people to see the king in his final hours. 1952 soon became a year that would shape her life in many ways. the young princess began to feel distanced from her mother and sister, the people she needed most during this period of mourning.
By the time the king died in 1952, Princess Elizabeth had married. She'd become the mother of 2 children. So that when she ascended the throne, she still had a husband, she still had 2 children, but she had all the responsibilities of sovereignty, everything that came with being queen. So that meant that she was somewhat removed from her sister. Now, Princess Margaret's mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was engulfed, as she put it, in great clouds of black. So she wasn't there for her daughter either. She was totally consumed with her grief. So who did Margaret have? Nobody really, except Peter Townsend. And that closeness grew from that time. And it developed into love.
The one closest male in her life was now gone, leaving a large hole for Margaret to fill. In her grief, Margaret sought to find a man who could sympathize with her loss. Captain Peter Townsend had served as the late king's equerry and had known the princess since she was 14. 16 years her senior, Townsend was a handsome, decorated soldier and a trusted friend of the royal family.
Well, I think, how did she feel falling in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend? I think that's a question only she could have answered. You know, how does anybody feel when they're falling in love with somebody? You know, if we all think of how we felt, then that's exactly how she would have felt. And he joined the king's household as a equerry when she was 15. So, and he was 16 years older than her. So he wouldn't have taken a great deal. I mean, apart from being his boss's daughter, he wouldn't have taken a great deal of interest in her. And certainly when he first joined the household, he wouldn't have had any kind of romantic notions about her whatsoever. It was only later on that their feelings developed. And one reason for this was the loss of King George VI, the father, that she absolutely adored. And I've always said that when people have said to me about Townsend being the great love of her life, no, he wasn't. In my view, the great love of her life, the man she absolutely loved, was her father.
Margaret found herself growing closer and closer to Peter for a source of comfort and romance. The young princess was in love. However, the deep romance between the pair posed a major problem. Townsend was a married man, and in 1952, he divorced his wife with the intention of marrying Margaret. Her distance from her father pushed Margaret deeper into the arms of Peter, and a year later, Peter asked for her hand in marriage. The princess said yes. Naturally, Margaret rushed to her sister to relay the news, unaware of the immediate challenges she would face. The Church of England bans marriage to divorcees, and by law, royals are removed from the line of succession if they break this ban. A fate her uncle, Edward VIII, suffered only 15 years earlier. Upon marrying Peter Townsend, Princess Margaret Rose would lose her civil income and role as a working royal. Queen Elizabeth had a tough decision to make. Would she allow her sister to marry the man she loved, or would she refuse as head of the church?
It is absolutely not true to say, as has been said, that the Queen prevented them from marrying. She didn't at all. the Queen stood back and she said to Princess Margaret, "This is a decision that you are going to have to make."
Under the 1772 Royal Marriages Act, Margaret had to wait until the age of 25 before becoming engaged, without the monarch's approval and consent. Elizabeth therefore asked her sister to wait 2 years before making a decision.
Then it was decided, and Churchill was behind this, that Townsend should be got rid of. He should be sent abroad. And this is exactly what happened. He was given the choice of 3 postings abroad as an air attaché at our embassies, and he chose the one in Brussels. The reason being that he'd got 2 sons in school here, and the option of being in Johannesburg, which was an option, was much too far, so he chose the Brussels option. Now, Princess Margaret and her mother had gone off on an official tour of Rhodesia, and the princess had been promised that Townsend would not leave the country until after she returned. And as it turned out, he was banished 2 days before she got back.
In 1955, Townsend returned to Britain. Margaret was now 25 years old and no longer needed her sister's consent to marry. The press followed Townsend around everywhere to get an inkling of what the couple's decision would be.
There was, huge press interest in this. There were polls taken. Should Princess Margaret be allowed to marry? Shouldn't she be allowed to marry? Overwhelming result that yes, she should be allowed to marry if that's what she wanted. It did rumble on for a couple more years because, as she said to me, we had this arrangement whereby if he was going to be in London, because he wanted to go off traveling the world, but if he was in London, he should pop in for a drink. Well, the minute that they tried that, the press was still camped outside the gates of Clarence House where she lived with her mother. And she said to me, it just wouldn't work. It just didn't work. Because it was the start of renewed speculation. There was even one headline, "They're together again." Whoa, this is, and the reason being, of course, that nobody knew the truth behind the matter.
Margaret had to make a choice: duty or personal gratification, the monarchy or her heart.
A decision not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend is reached by Britain's Princess Margaret, here arriving with her mother for a formal family appearance at London's Royal Opera House. In putting duty and religion ahead of her heart, Margaret had the example of her sister, the Queen, who dutifully entertained the President of Portugal while the family crisis neared a climax. Queen Mother Elizabeth approved her daughter's decision. Strongly opposing the marriage was the Archbishop of Canterbury. But Margaret decided alone, strengthened, she said, by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend. The war hero whose divorce prevented the marriage returns to duty in Belgium. Mindful of her church's teaching, conscious of her duty to Britain, Princess Margaret has made her momentous decision.
The princess was alone once again. Life after Captain Townsend was not all bad for Margaret. The public and press had fallen in love with the Queen's only sister. Without the scandal surrounding Peter, Margaret now had a lot more free time and could be often spotted at glamorous parties, entertaining crowds of friends with anecdotes and songs.
She became, from a pretty child, she did become a stunningly beautiful woman.
Margaret had even become a fashion icon, sometimes overshadowing her older sister in newspapers across the world.
In the 50s, 1950s, the world's media was interested and wanted photographs of only two women. One was Elizabeth Taylor, the actress, and the other was Princess Margaret. And the reason being was that they were seen to be so fascinating by the news media, and because they were both incredibly beautiful.
But with the princess now approaching 30, Queen Elizabeth II was becoming more and more concerned about Margaret still being single. Suitable options for marriage were dwindling, and yet tabloid speculation was rising like a storm. In the end, it was photographer and designer Antony Armstrong Jones who caught the eye of Princess Margaret.
Now I've crowned you my princess, though there's nothing in a name that you're a princess. May I call you princess?
However, Tony was a commoner, and high society deemed him an unconventional match for a royal princess. The charming photographer was the son of Welsh barrister Ronald Armstrong Jones and his first wife, Anne Missay, later the Countess of Ross. Tony's parents divorced when he was only 5 years old. Soon after, his mother married Lawrence Parsons, 6th Earl of Ross, with whom she had 2 more sons. His childhood was not a loving one. Tony felt emotionally starved and distinctly inferior to his mother's 2 sons with the Earl. Tony grew close to his sister Susan, but his rocky relationship with his mother continued right into adulthood. As a schoolboy, he contracted polio while on holiday at their country home in Wales. Tony spent 6 months at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary recuperating, but continued to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Tony attended Eton College and then went on to study architecture at Cambridge University. However, the young student spent most of his time rowing, flunked his second-year exams, and consequently dropped out to pursue his true passion, photography. The rising star was associated with all sorts of seedy rumors, with much speculation about his sexuality, relations with men, and rebellious lifestyle. Tony was worlds apart from the stoic and dutiful war hero Peter Townsend. But it was these exact differences which excited Princess Margaret.
They'd met at a private dinner party in 1958. A great friend of Tony's and a great friend of Princess Margaret, as well as her lady-in-waiting, was Lady Elizabeth Cavendish. And Lady Elizabeth was giving a private dinner party at her parents' house in Chelsea. And among the guests that evening was Tony Armstrong Jones. That particular evening, he didn't have much of an effect on her. She didn't give him very much of a thought. Until afterwards, a friend of hers was going off on some kind of diplomatic mission and said, could I take some, it would be very nice to have a photograph of you to take with me. And so she agreed to sit for photographs, and this guy said, and I know exactly the photographer, Tony Armstrong Jones. So he came, and then something clicked from then on. As it grew into romance, it was and it remained a secret.
Tony was an unconventional and shocking choice. But with Margaret now over the age of 25, the decision was all hers, and Armstrong Jones was not a divorcee. Becoming growingly desperate for her sister to marry and feeling a sense of guilt after the Peter Townsend scandal, the Queen approved of Margaret's relationship with Antony. In February 1960, the couple announced their engagement, catching the press and high society by surprise. Tony personally designed the princess's flower-themed engagement ring, which paid tribute to her middle name, Rose, as a romantic gesture.
Because nobody knew that she and Tony Armstrong Jones were seeing one another, when their engagement was announced, it really was a massive surprise. The media was reeling, partly through enthusiasm and excitement. Like, who is this man? He's a photographer. He's one of us. You know, he worked in Fleet Street. He was a fashion designer, a fashion photographer, a society photographer. He was part of the press, you know, and they didn't know they had no idea that he even knew Princess Margaret. So there was this immense surprise.
Wedding day rehearsal of Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong Jones with lots of excitement in Britain. Public attention is focused on last-minute preparations for the procession of the wedding couple from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace. The city will be in festive array, with each flagpole along the mall adorned with triple crowns.
The public were absolutely delighted, of course, because she was, at that time, she was bigger than Diana. You know, she really was the people's princess and some.
Margaret was entering the height of her popularity, and her fairy tale romance captured the hearts of the nation. On 6th of May 1960, Prince Philip walked Margaret down the aisle in Westminster Abbey, where she and Tony would finally make the relationship official.
There was vast interest and excitement. You know, people camped out for days. After, in inverted commas, not being allowed to marry Peter Townsend, now she was going to get married. So there was huge interest around the world. It was the first wedding to be televised, and 300 million people tuned in around the world to watch this.
Solemn groom and radiantly beautiful bride make their triumphal departure. A princess who rejected royalty and high society to find the man she loved. An artistic commoner of good family and highly successful freelance photographer. Mr. Armstrong Jones and his bride, Princess Margaret, Mrs. Antony Armstrong Jones, ride to the palace to a tumultuous ovation from the throng. By the time of the arrival of the wedding party at Buckingham Palace, even the gracious and dignified Queen and Queen Mother reveal they share in the mood of jubilation that dominates the day. Bride and groom make their traditional appearance on the palace balcony to be cheered to the echo by one of the greatest crowds ever to mass in Britain in recent history.
Following their marriage, the Queen gifted Antony the title of Earl of Snowdon, with Margaret becoming the Countess. As Tony was a commoner, the Queen specially created the title to elevate his status in society and offer security for the couple's offspring. In 1961, Princess Margaret gave birth to a son named David Armstrong Jones. At the time of his birth, David was fifth in line of succession to the British throne and heir to his father's title, Earl of Snowdon. 3 years later, Margaret and Tony welcomed the arrival of a second child, a baby girl titled Lady Sarah Armstrong Jones. Although quite hands-on parents for the era, Tony and Margaret still enjoyed the finer things in life and regularly attended social events both at home and abroad. The partnership broke down class barriers, widened Margaret's social circles beyond aristocracy, and brought a sense of fun to the monarchy. Actors, singers, celebrities, and bohemians all wanted the chance to mingle with the famed couple. The swinging 60s exploded, and so did Margaret and Tony's popularity. Being a princess and sister to the Queen, the palace required Margaret to place work in front of pleasure at times for the sake of the country. During the 60s, relations between the United States and United Kingdom were tense. The UK's power had weakened, and the government refused to support the US's involvement in the Vietnam War.
Why not negotiate now? So many ask me. The answer is that we and our South Vietnamese allies are wholly prepared to negotiate tonight.
Tensions between Prime Minister Harold Wilson and President Lyndon B. Johnson were therefore high. In 1965, Margaret and Tony flew across the pond and visited the United States. The initial idea for the visit came as an acceptance of an invitation from a former U.S. ambassador in London. However, as tensions rose between the two countries, Her Majesty's government developed the trip into one which consisted mainly of official and public engagements. But in their usual fashion, Tony and Margaret mixed duty with glamour.
The press had a field day when they arrived in New York. I think it was about 18 months earlier. The Beatles had flown in, and the airport rooftops, balconies, whatever there happened to be, vantage spots, were absolutely crowded with screaming fans. Well, Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon received the same treatment when they flew in November of 1965.
The couple started their tour on the Golden West Coast and enjoyed tram rides in San Francisco, partying with Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland, and visiting the set of Alfred Hitchcock's Torn Curtain in Hollywood. They even hopped on a plane to an Arizonan ranch where the couple rode horses in the warm weather.
America in 1965 was still, for most people, somewhere they could never hope to visit. It was a kind of Hollywood. You know, the whole idea of America was magical and Hollywood and all the rest of it. In November 1965, when Princess Margaret and the by now Lord Snowdon went off on their 3-week visit, that was followed here with huge interest and, of course, needless to say, in America too.
We are most grateful for your kind hospitality.
The main event took place at the infamous White House. President Johnson hosted a luxurious state dinner for the royal guests, and numerous famous faces attended, including Kirk Douglas. However, neither Johnson nor Margaret wanted to leave without a party. The famous guests danced until the early hours, with the president and princess even sharing an enthusiastic foxtrot to Everything's Coming Up Roses.
It's not to say, of course, that the tour was without critics. It did have its critics, and in Parliament, one MP who was the bane of Princess Margaret's life in the House of Commons, Willie Hamilton, demanded to know why we were footing the bill for this woman to have her jolly in America. Well, that's how it was perceived by some people, that it was more a holiday than an official royal visit.
But that wasn't the only late night of the trip for Tony and Margaret. On their final night, a goodbye dinner was held at the Four Seasons, which reportedly continued on until 3 a.m., a rock and roll farewell from the rock star couple. Unfortunately, Margaret and Tony's relaxed approach to the visit did not go down well back home. Government diplomats banned the royal couple from future trips to the U.S. due to their raucous behavior. Margaret and Tony were beginning to learn that their actions have consequences. By the 1970s, Margaret and Tony's marriage was beginning to crumble. The pair's lifestyles and interests took them in different directions, and soon the party atmosphere no longer felt as exciting. Antony pursued multiple affairs, which he made no effort to keep a secret. Rumors flew around the social scene that Tony had never been faithful to Margaret, not even at the beginning of their relationship.
Do you find your public image as a help or hindrance in these photographic exhibitions?
The clear-cut lifestyle of being the husband of a princess was not what he wanted anymore. He grew bored of attending royal events and opening hospitals, and consequently made life miserable for Margaret. Tony played with both the princess's mind and heart, leaving abusive notes in her books and disappearing for nights on end. He would often take long photography business trips abroad to carry out his affairs with several different women.
People do need to recognize that Tony really was a serial adulterer. After 3 years, really, the cracks were already on the wall.
In 1972, he started an extramarital relationship with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, a woman he would later marry and father a child with. The princess found herself feeling terribly lonely. The Queen and the Queen Mother adored Townsend. The princess tried bringing matters up with her sister and family. However, the Queen put the problems down to bumps in the road that all marriages face. Her mother and sister even thought Margaret was likely to be the problem. This reaction caused Margaret to spiral into a pit of misery and isolation. Margaret needed somewhere to get away. Colin Tennant had gifted the princess 10 acres of land on the island of Mystique as a wedding present, and it soon became her own private getaway, far from the pain of Tony's lifestyle.
The Caribbean island of Mystique became a very important feature in Princess Margaret's life. This was an island that, of course, Colin Tennant developed into really what you might describe as a hedonist playground.
Margaret started a love affair with the island and a series of lavish parties with her favorite people soon took place.
It was for her a haven. You know, she could just be who she was and enjoy. She just loved the Caribbean. You know, we remember that she first visited the Caribbean in 1955, and she fell in love with it then and never fell out of love with it.
However, being the sister of the Queen, things can only stay private for so long. Slowly, the tabloids caught wind of the princess's favorite destination, and this was the last thing anyone wanted to see.
Calling Battersea Power Station. Support the National Union of Mine Workers. Refuse to handle any coal.
During the 1970s, Britain was struggling. The economy was in tatters, power cuts and blackouts were rife, and people were plunging deeper and deeper into poverty. Waking up to images of the princess relaxing on a sun lounger in the Caribbean did not go down well with the public. Demands were made in Parliament to cut down her royal allowance. Many even believed that the princess was no longer important to the functioning of the monarchy. The Queen refused to make any cuts, but once again, her loyalty was being tested. As if that wasn't enough, the princess was about to find herself in another scandal, this time larger than any she had seen before. Whilst traveling to a house party in Scotland, Margaret met a man named Roddy Llewellyn in Café Royal in Edinburgh. Margaret began a long-standing affair with Roddy, despite the landscape gardener being 17 years her junior.
One always imagines that she was full of confidence. She wasn't. There was part of her that didn't have a lot of confidence at all. So Roddy was a tremendously beneficial figure in her life.
In 1976, the affair was exposed. A member of the paparazzi had managed to photograph the couple on holiday in Mystique, and the images were soon splashed everywhere.
Once Roddy was on the scene, it really did damage her reputation in the eyes of the public. They felt that she was demeaning herself, that she was letting the Queen and the monarchy down. It didn't do anything for her personal reputation at all. And the Queen wasn't happy about it either.
In 1978, Tony and Margaret accepted that the marriage was well and truly over. The palace released a statement saying that the Snowdons' relationship would formally end after 2 years of separation.
Where Tony was concerned, she never wanted to be a divorcee. This was never part of the plan, and to begin with, he told her that he didn't want a divorce either.
I'm naturally desperately sad in every way that this had to happen.
The iconic marriage came tumbling down. This was the first divorce in the royal family for 400 years. However, the announcement did not put an end to the commotion. The press refused to leave Margaret alone, and she turned to Roddy for comfort, continuing the romance even after her divorce. The Bohemian photographer moved on quickly after the historic divorce. In 1978, Tony remarried with his long-term fling Lucy Lindsay Hogg. The couple had one child together, Lady Frances Armstrong Jones, a half-sister of David and Sarah. However, Tony could not resist other women for long. He was rumored to have had a years-long affair with journalist Anne Hill. But the real blow to his relationship with Lindsay was the revelation that Tony had fathered a child out of wedlock with Melanie Cable Alexander. Lindsay and Tony divorced in 2000. Another shocking revelation about Tony exploded across the British press in 2004. It was revealed that Armstrong Jones had fathered another illegitimate child, born only a few weeks after he tied the knot with Margaret.
3 weeks into his honeymoon with Princess Margaret in 1960, Camilla Fry, an old friend of his, a couple called Jeremy and Camilla Fry, great friends of Tony's and of Margaret's, Camilla Fry gave birth to Tony's daughter. And this is, you know, he's just married Princess Margaret. They're only 3 weeks into their honeymoon, and this woman gives birth to his daughter. So Tony Snowdon was a serial adulterer.
There were even rumors Tony had relations with Jeremy. The revelation rocked Tony's scandalous reputation even more. Unlike her ex-husband, Margaret remained alone. The princess never remarried and instead engulfed herself in her commitments to royal engagements, her sister, and to the crown until she could no longer do so due to her declining health.
Throughout her life, Princess Margaret was dedicated and genuinely committed to her work as patron and president of something like 80-odd various organizations. She had an enormous range of interests that were reflected in the charities that she represented, and they all mattered very much to her. You know, she didn't want to be just a name on a letterhead.
A series of health problems haunted Margaret. In the 1970s, she suffered a nervous breakdown and began treatment for her depression.
In recent months, there have been persistent rumors about Princess Margaret's health. Tonight, the palace confirmed a royal doctor was called to see her this weekend, that he performed tests, and that she is unwell and confined to bed.
In 1985, she underwent a similar surgery to her father, King George VI, and had part of her left lung removed. By 1991, Margaret gave up smoking altogether to protect her health. However, she continued heavy drinking, a sign not all was well in her life. Princess Margaret's health rapidly declined in the late 90s. Between 1998 and 2001, Princess Margaret suffered 3 strokes and a bout of pneumonia. She could often be seen sitting in a wheelchair for mobility reasons and wearing dark glasses for her failing eyesight. The princess's once lavish lifestyle had finally caught up with her.
I think she was always essentially the same person, but of course, the effect of the strokes, you know, I think one of them meant that she was paralyzed down the left-hand side, and she was partially sighted. I think I'm right in saying she had peripheral view. So all of this, of course, impacted on her, and her depression. It was in reaction to how she was, her physical condition. You know, that there was actually no quality of life. She didn't see any of her men friends. She didn't take any telephone calls. The only man friend that she saw, tellingly, was Roger Llewellyn. he could visit, but she didn't want anybody else to see her as she was.
The years of smoking and heavy drinking eventually sent Margaret to an early grave. She passed away in London on the 9th of February 2002 after suffering from a fourth and final stroke at the age of 71.
It was a very sad end to her life, so that by the time she did die, she actually was ready to go.
My darling aunt had such a dreadful time in the last few years with her awful illness, and it was hard for, let alone her to bear it, but for all of us as well. And particularly she had such a wonderfully free spirit, and she loved life and lived it to the full.
Princess Margaret's funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on 15th of February 2002. 50 years to the day since her father's funeral took place at the exact same location. The funeral was therefore a doubly sad occasion for Queen Elizabeth II, and one of the only moments in her reign where the monarch has publicly shed a tear. Margaret also predeceased her mother by nearly 2 months. The Queen Mother insisted on attending her youngest daughter's funeral, despite suffering from ill health herself.
A final farewell to a princess who was today remembered as a mother, a daughter, and a sister. The Queen wiping a tear as Princess Margaret's coffin left Windsor for the crematorium. It was her own wish that even her children, Lord Linley and Lady Sarah Chatto, shouldn't follow. A private family funeral was what she had requested. Prince Charles, who spoke this week of his darling aunt, following as the Princess Royal led the mourners. Hidden behind tinted windows, the Queen Mother came by people carrier. Increasingly frail, she hasn't been seen in public since November.
Antony Armstrong Jones also attended the funeral and paid his respects to his dear ex-wife. In 2017, Lord Snowdon's death reunited the royal family once more. The once charming and handsome photographer passed away at his home, aged 86, and requested to be buried in a family plot near Carnarvon, Wales. The Queen, Prince Philip, and senior members of the royal family attended a memorial service for Armstrong Jones, paying their respects to a dear brother-in-law and uncle. Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong Jones may not have had the fairy tale ending everyone hoped for, but it cannot be denied that the rock star couple paved the way for a very modern monarchy. The marriage did not reach the success levels of Elizabeth and Philip. However, the first royal divorce in 400 years altered the future of the British royal family.
She actually helped modernize the monarchy. She brought monarchy in to the 20th century. Princess Margaret was really the first senior important royal to be divorced. That in itself said to people, do you see, the royal family are the same as all of us.
Tony and Margaret's romance changed the very essence of royal marriages forever.
She was responsible for the normalization of monarchy. They do the same sorts of things that we do.
Margaret and Tony truly were a one-of-a-kind pairing.